Okay, so Mrs. H Psychology, a video to help you with the psychodynamic exam essay questions. So this will introduce it, and then there'll be others as well. So this is part one. This is specifically for the AQA specification for psychology, and with AQA approaches, which psychodynamic comes under, comes in paper 2. Okay, so let's have a look at the spec. And just a reminder that the specification for approaches is here, but specifically for us, we're looking at the psychodynamic approach. So role of the unconscious, personality, id, ego, superego, defense mechanisms, and psychosexual stages. What it doesn't tell you is that you will also need to be able to evaluate, obviously, and to be able to make comparisons with the other approaches, and also to talk about and discuss for example, Freud's contribution, psychodynamics, contribution to our understanding of human behaviour. So what we're going to look at first of all is a very old paper, but these will still be very relevant, okay, because they're still very similar to the ones that are coming up on the sample papers. So this is from June 02, it's the old spec Psy-B4, AQA spec B, but they're very relevant even today. So we've got here the psychoanalytic approach has both strengths and weaknesses. Discuss and refer to at least one other perspective in your answer. So I'm going to talk you through this, but I'll show you what one of the new questions is like as well, and you'll see there's very similar, they're very, very similar. So basically, let's just look at this question. It says, discuss psychoanalytic approach, discuss this statement, but refer to at least one other perspective. Perspective meaning approach, okay? So really what this means is discuss the psychoanalytic approach, but in that discussion include comparison points with other approaches. So with the old MART scheme, you had 5 what we would call AO1s, and in those days we call them AO2s, but now we're talking about them as AO3s. So 5 marks for descriptive stuff, and here we want to include lots of key terms, very nice and accurate, lots of detail really on unconscious processes, structure of the personality, and psychosexual stages really. Okay, so our AO1s are going to come from that, and then we have access to 7 for this mark. This paper, this question is 12 marks, so we've got 7 AO3 marks for discussion and analysis, in which we need to make sure we're comparing with other approaches. So let's have a look at what we've got. One example could be comparison with the humanists, and for another question I've put this together. So we're going to refer to this, and you can pause it on the screen and have a look at it, but this is not really covering everything you need, but it's just an introduction, it's just an example, okay? So we could talk about, for example, the negative approach that psychodynamic is, because it believes we're driven by id, whereas humanists are obviously very positive, the belief that we're born with this innate desire to reach our full potential, so self-actualization. We could make comparisons with conscious and unconscious decision making, for example, free will determinism, a nice comparison point. We could include therapies as well, and possibly past, present as well. So it's up to you which ones. I would say, I don't know, possibly the first 3 for me would be the ones that I would probably pick, although I do like this therapy one. Okay, so let's have a look at developing those a little bit further. With my guys, you might like to use the A3 sheets, and I'll just bring those up on the screen so you can have a look and see what I'm referring to. So with our A3 sheets, we do some summary sheets like this, which is just getting the basic points down. So key terms would be our new terminology, explaining that for the second one. So this is very similar to what a lot of you will use with Peel. Right point, explain that, give a bit of evidence and evaluate. Okay, so this would be point, explaining that whatever the point is that you're saying, provide some sort of evidence or evaluation. With Freud, we haven't got a huge amount of evidence as we have with some of the other approaches, but we could start to evaluate and develop it here. So in our evaluation, obviously we're making comparisons. Perhaps here we could put the comparisons with the other approach, and a comment really about how effective that is. Is it better or worse than the other approach? Is it you know, does it deal with more reliability, validity, bias, generalization, etc., etc. So I'm just going to pause and bring up the other sheet that we tend to use. And for my guys, I would recommend that you get one of these and you add in as you go along here with this particular essay. So what I'm trying to get you to do, remember, is just making a point and briefly explaining it is really very basic. It's just going to get you a level 1. If you can expand on that, perhaps with some illustration from it, and start to evaluate it with evaluative points, so almost like naming your evaluation, signaling that it's a strength or a weakness, that will get you further up, possibly into level 3. But really, in order to get high level 3 and level 4, we've really got to fully explain this. It's the so what bit of the question. So what? Why is that a strength? Why is that a weakness? So however, a so what? So really fully explaining whatever the criticism or the positive point is, the strength is. Okay, so easy for you guys, if you haven't got one of these sheets, just to produce something in brief form, but it's just to try to illustrate to you, you've got to be getting further along here in order to access those higher marks. Some of my students have found that very useful. So we're just going to pause that, and we're going to have a look at the evaluation. So I've gone back to the question, just to refresh memory. Psychoanalytic approach has both strengths and weaknesses. Discuss and refer to at least one other perspective in your answer. So you're really writing a discussion question of this, but making sure that you refer to other perspectives. So let's have a look at some possibilities. Criticism. For example, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic approach uses non-scientific methods. We know that they use case studies, so this is a great comparison point. We can compare it with a behaviorist, cognitive, biological, for example. Here, case studies are great for getting rich qualitative data in order to understand why somebody might behave in the way they do, but we know it's very subjective, whereas the behaviorists use very objective, empirical methods, in other words, experiments, and the advantage they have then is that we could replicate their research. We've got more reliability because of that replication. Or you could go down a different route and compare it perhaps with the humanists and say it's very similar to the humanists and their subjective view of an individual and their phenomenological approach, and that the individual is more, the subjective view of the individual is more important than objective reality, and finishing off with some development of why that is an advantage, why the subjective view may be advantageous over these very scientific views or approaches. So you could pursue that for one of your rows. You could talk about lack of evidence that we have with Freud and psychodynamic, for example, checking how effective their therapy is, and perhaps you could compare it with Rogers' CCT. Perhaps you could bring in the Q sort, where they, even though they're a very subjective approach, they also try briefly to objectively measure it. And my guys have got some research, Butler and Haig, for example, their correlational work. So you could develop that. You could develop key area being reductionism. And obviously with Freud, the idea is that all behavior arises from this tripartite mind, the dynamic unconscious. Maybe make comparisons with that with, for example, the humanists and their very holistic view of seeing the individual within their social context and why that might be better. Or you could argue why reductionism is better to finish off further down that row. Free will determinism, comparisons obviously with humanists, behaviorists, but important again, when you're talking about this, go back to your A3, that big A3, and remember you've got to be thinking and using your notes to get further along this, this particular row. Okay, with strengths. General influence on psychology, so understanding of importance of early childhood, and obviously psychodynamic has really been influential on others, for example Bowlby, and you could introduce just tiny little bit of information, Bowlby's maternal deprivation hypothesis, and how he was influenced by Freud, by psychodynamic approach. We could also talk about the influence of the unconscious driving our behavior and our general acceptance of that today, for example, with defense mechanisms. But you might want to, again, make some comparison with something, another approach like the behaviorist and their environmental determinism, for example. We could say another main area of influence is therapy, and obviously bringing in another area of therapy, for example, humanists would be a good one. Okay, so there's plenty of information that you could use to evaluate. Remember that a minimum you need 2 of those rows, and for those of you trying to access the high grades, you wanted to go at least 3 of those fully developed rows that, just to remind you, look like this. Okay, so key terms, accurate terms, lots of new terminology to be used to show that you've done some serious learning. We look at the mark scheme here. We've got an answer based solely on Freud with reference to another perspective can gain full marks, but a maximum 7 if you've only got one side. Remember, it's discussed, so we need both sides, and a maximum of 6 if there's no reference at all to any other perspective. So you're very much limiting. Remember, this is a question that's out of 12 marks. The mark bands here, I'll leave you to have a look at that. But we also have, for example, reference to A-level spec paper, the new AQA level spec paper. I think this was their specimen paper 2, said outline psychodynamic approach, discuss one or more differences between psychodynamic, and they've given you specifically another approach, the humanists. Watch out for this. They could easily give this to get you to compare it with behaviourists, biological, all sorts. Okay, so once again, our AO1 content is going to be what we've just covered. And then in terms of comparisons, we've got the same little grid up there. So this question is slightly different because it's tell us about the psychodynamic, but then talk about the differences. So this is where you're getting your AO3s. You're going to make comments about how they differ or how they are similar using this information. Here's the mark scheme as well for your different levels. So outline of the approach is accurate, lots of lovely terminology. Discussion is thorough, meaning you need pretty much all of these different comparisons. It's very clear, and obviously you're using this specialist terminology in order to access those higher marks. Okay, and then we'll go on to part 2, will be another question.